The most dangerous man in Serena Vale's life was never the Mafia boss who ruled half the city. It was her father, the man who taught her that pain was normal, obedience meant survival, and her life always had a price. Gregory Vale looked untouchable in public, but behind closed doors, he was the kind of monster who would sacrifice even his own daughter to save his collapsing empire. And then Serena crossed paths with Adrian Russo, a violent man who recognized evil instantly because he came from the same world. That is where this story turns addictive, because the real question is not whether Adrian takes her away, but whether Serena is being saved, broken all over again, or transformed into someone entirely new.
Observe the clinical trajectory of Serena Vale's existence. A biological entity appraised as a mere ledger entry long before her humanity was acknowledged. Bartered as liquid collateral for a paternal deficit, she is presented to the alpha, Adrian Russo. However, the psychological frame shifts. Tonight, his ocular focus tracks a survivor, not a fiscal trophy. Russo identifies a dormant resilience, a grace her progenitor spent years attempting to extinguish. This is not a chronicle of her termination, but the formal rematerialization of a psychological ghost. Remain present as the atmospheric tension peaks. Document your current city in the dossier notes. I must track where these echoes stabilize. Outside, the precipitation falls with the consistency of heavy black ink. Within the confines of the Mercedes, every respiration serves as a somatic reminder of paternal malice. She monitors the neon light bleed across the glass, manifesting a dissociative desire to exit this dimension entirely. Could she merge with that luminescence, she might bypass the purple blossoms of physical trauma and the high-status shadow seated beside her. Gregory Vale offered no psychological harbor, only frigid directives. He vocalizes commands to obfuscate the evidence of his own violence without granting her eye contact, categorizing her agony as a minor logistical glitch in his fiscal calendar. She palpates her throbbing mandible, experiencing the localized heartbeat of a private, contained catastrophe. He mandates a protocol of absolute silence and submissiveness, processing her like a cargo shipment approaching the terminal. When she verbalizes a plea for a single shred of empathy, his affect remains frozen. He has ceased to function as a father. He is now a merchant offloading a depleted, dysfunctional unit of inventory. That act of abandonment constituted a definitive psychological severance. In that temporal flash, she was reclassified as third-party debt. They penetrate the obsidian epicenter of a manner where Adrian Russo's sub-vocalizations carry the weight of law. This individual is the phantom architect of the city's most formidable and clandestine empire. We are currently peering into a socioeconomic void where identities evaporate and deficits are reconciled in plasma. Gregory, a megalomaniac narcissist masquerading as a moral pillar, is liquidating his daughter's flesh to maintain his financial buoyancy. A hollow patriarch trading a fractured girl to balance a ledger, framing his betrayal as rational commerce. The subject anticipates the cold steel of a subterranean cell, but the visual field adapts. The gates unveil a monument of glass and black obsidian, radiating like a collapsing star. It is a fortification constructed upon classified data, projecting through the midnight like a fever dream extracted from a forgotten tragic epoch. Material wealth exudes from every surface, chilled marble and unsettling statuary. Standing in the atmospheric gale, her silk garment adopts the psychological weight of a funeral shroud. She exhibits a visible tremor, recognizing that the man tasked with her protection has instead ritualistically dressed her as a sacrificial unit for a deity of the underground. She maintains her survivalist persona, donning his expensive armor only because the alternative was biological termination. Upon entry, the butler's gaze reflects either profound empathy or a deep-seated revulsion toward her father. He provides the requisite nonverbal signal the sovereign is prepared to inspect his most delicate new acquisition. This residence functions as a mausoleum for high-value inanimate objects. Overpriced and emotionally inert, they navigate corridors of silent aestheticism until reaching the epicenter of this power structure. Behind those reinforced doors resides the individual who now maintains a literal leash on her autonomic pulse in her future. There is no theatrical entrance, merely the mechanical click of a lock. Adrien Rousseau avoids the beast archetype. He sits as a nocturnal deity, agitating amber whiskey by the hearth. He is composed of sharp anatomical edges and high-end silk, a predator entirely integrated into this environment of extreme luxury. He possesses a higher degree of aesthetic symmetry than the nightmares predicted. Approximately 35 years of age, with eyes capable of shattering glass. His vocalizations are a low-frequency, lethal melody. He acknowledges their temporal delay with a psychological calm that is significantly more alarming than any overt display of rage. He secures her with a gaze that exerts the pressure of a mountain range. While her progenitor attempts to market her like a commodity, Adrien deploys a blade of empirical truth. He documents every minute of the 3 weeks Gregory spent in a state of submissive begging, reducing the moral pillar to a pathetic domestic servant. He enters her personal space, carrying the olfactory markers of dark tobacco and premium spice. He methodically enumerates her father's ethical failures, physically towering over her until her respiratory function falters. This is the precise moment the transaction transitions from an abstract concept to a terrifying physical reality. The father attempts to negotiate her market worth, but Adrien terminates the dialogue. She is a human entity, not an asset. He verifies her age, 23, and then issues a command for her to achieve eye contact, forcing her to observe her own transition through the mirror of his cold, clinical stare. In his ocular focus, there is zero evidence of sexual predation, only a surgeon's diagnostic interest in her pathology. He maps the hematomas on her face and the structural scarring of her skin. Then he poses the one inquiry the world bypassed. Was it him? Did he inflict this upon you? The perceived rotation of the earth ceases. For the first time, the cruelty obscured by her father's social standing is clinically exposed. Under the crushing gravitational pull of Rousseau's attention, her truth emerges as a fractured whisper. The atmosphere densifies, becoming cold and electrically charged, mirroring the seconds preceding a fatal strike. Maintaining a low decibel tone, Adrien mandates her father's immediate exit. The contractual parameters have shifted, and the individual who commodified his child has no further status here. Gregory attempts a verbal defense, but Adrien's aura effectively chokes the words, compelling a high-anxiety, shameful retreat into the night. The acoustic boom of the closing portal signifies either an exit or a new form of containment. Serena remains in the vacuum of silence, discarded by her primary biological bond and left with the city's most significant shadow. Her father neglected even a final visual check as he abandoned her for the ultimate time. He directs her to be seated, his tone notably lacking in predicted cruelty. As the logs reach their thermal limit and the rain strikes the glass, he simply observes her. There is no predatory intent in his posture. Instead, he acknowledges her trauma with a blunt, clinical truth. You are experiencing pain. Her internal psychological barriers collapse, leading to a full disclosure of secrets. She documents the fractured ribs and the persistent state of terror induced by her father's hand. Adrien processes this with a stillness more haunting than a scream. He functions as a silent witness to the total wreckage of her psyche. He initiates a medical call immediately, prioritizing her physiological healing over behavioral obedience. Serena's cognitive processing falters because this is a deviation from the acquisition protocol. He is not performing the role of a master. He is acting as a guardian. We are witnessing the total rewriting of the script. She finally verbalizes the core question. Why has he not exercised his ownership rights? Adrian regards her with a fatigue that appears ancient. The diagnosis is clear. He is not a collector of fractured spirits. He shares zero psychological DNA with the monster who raised her. He clarifies his fundamental policy. Humans are never utilized as currency. Her father committed a fatal strategic error fueled by his own narcissism. For Adrian, the original debt is nullified, and a new objective, preserving her biological life, commences under the canopy of his absolute protection. He guarantees her a fortified environment, nutritional intake, restorative sleep, and clinical care. When she confesses her total lack of alternative sanctuary, he states the obvious. He will never permit her return to the aggressor. The access points to her previous existence have been permanently welded shut. He decodes the masks of men like Gregory, the individuals who rebrand domestic assault as discipline. He recognizes the scent of a predator with high-functioning accuracy, and he is resolved that such moral rot will find no host within his jurisdiction. As the medical practitioner enters, the room undergoes a phase shift from a prison to a sanctuary. Adrian retreats, yielding her to the compassion she has been deprived of for 23 years, while the midnight storm serves to wash the metabolic filth from the external world. "You are secure for this duration, darling," Adrian vocalizes before departing. He promises proximity should her stability falter. Silence saturates the room, leaving Serena with a clinician whose warmth feels like an alien stimulus. She deactivates her defenses, mapping her pain, but the assessment of her ribs triggers a blinding torment. The skeletal structure remains intact, Dr. Chen states, serving as a stable anchor. The hematomas are significant, but you will persist. Serena does not perceive herself as a survivor. She self-identifies as refuse. The doctor administers pharmacology, treats the facial trauma, and stabilizes her thorax, forecasting a difficult recovery period. The expansive chamber cools, illuminated only by the failing embers and the rain's rhythmic distress against the glass. Time becomes a blur of shadows until the door articulates. It is not Adrian. A young female in black identifies herself as Elena. "Allow me to guide you to your suite," she says. Serena whispers, "A dedicated room for me." Lacking any remaining trajectory, Serena follows her through corridors of polished mineral. A reinforced door swings open, revealing a chamber of such high-status opulence it serves as a critique of her past. Ivory silk cascades over a massive bed, framed by midnight apertures and a lavatory carved from amber-toned marble. A peril is staged, Elena notes, her gaze lingering on the subject's blood-stained remnants. Superior to those ruins, utilize the water. Should you require nourishment, dial 0 on the rotary. Serena's voice is a mere echo. Why provide kindness? Elena's affect softens, a brief flicker of genuine empathy manifesting. Elena describes a psyche pushed to the point of self-erasure. She posits that Russo is no archetypal monster, simply an individual navigated by his own internal specters. "Seek restorative sleep," she whispers. "Tomorrow the narrative changes." As the latch secures, Serena palpates the cool marble, grounding herself in this impossible new reality. The bed functions as a cloud of weightless velvet. The wardrobe, a curated museum of silk she previously viewed only through glass. In the deep stone bath, she could theoretically submerge her grief. However, the mirror provides a nightmare. Her bruised visage is a constellation of violet and black, a topographical map of her own tragedy. Her face is a fractured map, her eyes two hollow voids where hope was previously stored. She is a stranger to her own identity. In the steam, the water thermal shocks her skin, a ritualistic attempt to cleanse the perceived filth. Enveloped in an oversized garment, she buries herself beneath the textiles, attempting to vanish. Restorative sleep remains an elusive ghost. In the dark, her cognitive patterns form a dissonant orchestra. The clinical truth is caustic. Her progenitor commodified her soul for a debt. Yet Russo, the designated wolf, is the only entity who declined to bite. He has transitioned into an accidental savior within a hierarchy of monsters. The subject secures the perimeter, a futile ritual against a systemic collapse. Physiological exhaustion coincides with the onset of crepuscular shadows. An auditory stimulus, a forceful percussion, indicates the superior's arrival. Upon rising, intercostal neuralgia serves as a somatic map of her extensive history of physical trauma. She navigates the corridors with a calculated, melancholic grace, camouflaging her physiological distress beneath layered textiles. The olfactory profile of roasted alkaloids guides her toward a sterile, industrial-grade culinary space. Adrian occupies the environment with the stillness of a high-functioning deity, his vocus oscillating between digital data and his vessel. His ocular expression remains an impenetrable facade as he inquires into the status of her dermal lacerations. Positioned in the liminal space of the threshold, she articulates a dual reality: biological fragmentation paired with a nascent cognitive awakening. He directs her toward a surplus of nutrients, facilitated by a domestic subordinate who exits like a dissipating hallucination. She ingests the offerings with a primal urgency and instinctual anchoring to the living plane. This carbohydrate consumption serves as the primary empirical evidence of her survival. Following the meal's conclusion, Adrian facilitates a caffeine transfer, establishing intense ocular synchronization. Abandoning his mobile device, he prepares for a formal psychological deconstruction. The subject maintains a white-knuckled grip on the container, symptomatic of a crisis response. He probes for the temporal origin of her trauma. She dates the onset to her 14th year, following maternal expiration. Without the maternal buffer, she became the primary recipient of aggression. Adrian's facial musculature immobilizes into a lithic mask of suppressed hostility. He introduces the inquiry of sexual predation. Her rapid lateral cephalic movement signifies a negative response. The abuse was strictly localized to physical battery and ocular trauma from glass. For the analyst, this distinction represents the only manageable variable in her pathology. She describes the residence as a structured confinement where her hemorrhaging remained unobserved. Academic excellence and verbal inhibition functioned as her psychological camouflage. The prestige of the Vale patronymic acted as a social barrier. Adrian emits a guttural subvocal expression of contempt. He views high-status nomenclatures merely as expanded tactical objectives. He is currently auditing the systemic decay before performing a radical social excision. Her paternal figure is a phantom architect of fraudulent structures, maintained by deceit and fiscal instability. The inevitable systemic failure has arrived. He weaponized his offspring as a sacrificial buffer, though the gambit failed. When she inquires about his trajectory, Russo's vocalization is frigid. His outcome remains a dark, unresolved variable. The subject's utility has expired, Adrian observes, but the depth of his descent is your executive decision. He transfers the locus of control to her. Define the parameters of his termination. Serena experiences a catatonic freeze. For 21 years, she was a passive instrument, Now she is tasked with the orchestration of his destruction. His gaze acknowledges her as a significant entity for the first time. Sensing her cognitive paralysis, he grants her a temporal reprieve. "This facility is your sanctuary," he dictates. "Focus exclusively on biological homeostasis." Perspective planning is deferred until her mental fog undergoes a full atmospheric dispersal. Is my autonomy genuine?" she inquires. His ocular intensity projects an uncomfortable veracity. "The egress is unobstructed. Your status is that of a voluntary affiliate. The paternal dynasty has reached terminal incineration. You are now the primary narrator," he remarks, abandoning her to the solar warmth with a nascent glimmer of optimism. 7 days elapse in a disorienting, dreamlike stasis. She traverses the estate as a spectral presence draped in silk. She exists as a high-status visitor who is simultaneously a casualty of a domestic conflict. Observing the specialized labor of attendants like Marcus, she perceives that her current amenities are funded by the liquidation of her historical trauma. Adrian persists as a peripheral silhouette, preoccupied with clandestine operations, yet leaving subtle altruistic markers. Their coexistence occurs in the hushed intervals between verbal exchanges. Ultimately, the cognitive dissonance of his unprovoked benevolence triggers a breakdown. In the nocturnal silence, she seeks to analyze the core motivations behind his visual facade. The archive serves as her secular sanctuary, permeated with the scent of aged dermis and classified data. She utilizes the verticality of the shelves to escape, while Adrian remains hunched over his workstation like an obsessed architect. She retreats into the depths of a massive chair, feigning ocular fixation on text, while her emotional focus remains miles from the literature. "Provide a clinical, honest assessment," she demands. He attempts a superficial evasion, but she maintains her inquiry into why he would preserve a low-value asset. Adrian ceases his activity. He terminates his reading with a percussive closure and rotates, his entire presence exerting a gravitational, predatory pressure on her. He tells the story of a 17-year-old boy who witnessed his father selling his sister to pay off a gambling debt. Despite her intelligence, she was treated as nothing more than a financial asset. He speaks in a flat, emotionless tone, but beneath it lies a deep psychological wound that has never truly healed. She returned as a psychological vacuum, eventually opting for permanent cessation of biological functions. The progenitor exhibited total empathy failure, eventually expiring in a state of self-inflicted squalor. Adrian's metacarpophalangeal joints blanch as he grips the chair, the sole indicator of the cyclonic rage oscillating within his thoracic cavity. Regarding the primary offender, Russo ensured his physiological termination. He engineered a clandestine syndicate exclusively to facilitate a protracted, cold-blooded retribution. Serena does not engage in flight behavior. Instead, she experiences an emotional release for the youth who dismantled his own psyche to evolve into a mechanism of vengeance. "Eschew the hero narrative," Adrian rasps, his timbre a discordant blend of abrasive mineral and soft fiber. His sovereignty is established atop a literal necropolis. His lineage lacks luminosity. He projects a smile reminiscent of a midwinter dawn, visually striking, yet possessing a lethal sub-zero temperature. He identifies as an entity of the void, yet notes that her father's moral putrefaction triggered a visceral disgust. Observing her disposal like discarded matter served as the catalyst. This intervention, he confesses, may constitute a pathological attempt at retroactive atonement for a sibling he was unable to protect. Serena terminates her reading as the atmospheric pressure intensifies. Adrian outlines the methodical eradication of the paternal legacy. While Gregory exhibited desperate survival instincts, Adrian deployed a phalanx of litigious predators to dismantle his reality, segment by bloody segment, until only particulate remains. The empirical data induces a physiological revulsion. He catalogs the transgressions, embezzlement of philanthropic assets, and systemic exploitation of families, all while maintaining a sanctimonious persona. For 20 years, Gregory Vale functioned as a suit-wearing parasite, extracting vitality from every individual susceptible to his manufactured charisma. "You were his ultimate liquidity event," Adrian remarks, his gaze possessing a surgical sharpness. He exposes a $2 million life insurance policy, naming her as the decedent. Her expiration was the intended windfall. Every instance of physical battery was merely a preliminary exercise for the scheduled permanent erasure of her existence. He sought a dual fiscal victory: human trafficking followed by an insurance payout upon her demise. However, Adrian refused to conform to the algorithm. Now her progenitor languishes in a confinement of his own making, unable to access the capital, while she remains shielded within the Rousseau containment zone. Adrian implements a total information blockade, severing all routes of evasion. He presents the quantitative record of retribution for her clinical review. The ultimatum is binary: descend into the obscurity of absolute poverty, or incinerate his reputation into a lasting testament of human malignancy. She recalls the saline taste of suppressed childhood memories, concealing dermal abrasions beneath expensive textiles while reacting to his proximity. To him, she was never a biological entity, but a discrepant accounting entry to be reconciled. His recollected gaze functions as a corrosive agent, dissolving her cognitive equilibrium with a cold, analytical cruelty. She accepts the blinding luminosity of raw data. A dangerous labial curvature defines Adriana's expression as they architect the command center for the subject's ruin. Over 14 days, they perform a psychological autopsy on her father's morality, composing a dark symphony of total institutional disintegration. Chronological boundaries vanish, stripping away social facades until only the visceral reality of 0400 remains. He articulates the exorbitant cost of his self-governance. Simultaneously, she mourns the spectral remnants of the child who nearly succumbed to the absolute weight of her father's influence. He transitions from a protective role to an instructor of clandestine mechanics, deconstructing the physiology of deception. He reframes her psychological trauma, commanding her to convert her panic into a tactical asset. She is instructed to utilize her chronic apprehension as a whetstone, tempering a resolve that is structurally unbreakable. During a session, he detects a residual spark of resilience that survived the vacuum of her developmental years. He posits that her historical endurance is not a pathology of weakness, but empirical proof of a reinforced core that her father, despite his stolen authority, lacked the capacity to replicate. Serena parries the metaphorical blow, her movements reflecting his predatory refinement. "I am undergoing a structural failure," she gasps through labored respiration. He maintains the intensity. "Fortitude is not the absence of trauma. It is the recalcitrant act of resuming a vertical position after every impact." They persist until her lungs ache, but the psychological tether finally begins to sever. She locates him within the olfactory environment of peat and archival gloom. "Specify the temporal window," she requests. He elevates his focus, his eyes reflecting a hunter's predatory exhaustion. 168 hours. They intend to canonize him at the gala. It provides the optimal theater for the public dissection of his decaying legacy. "I am participating in the deployment," Serena declares, her vocal tone indicating high-level resolve. Adrian evaluates her psychological fortitude. I require ocular confirmation of his total collapse, she insists. He provides a grave affirmation. Acknowledged. However, you will operate within my tactical wake. I will calibrate this operation so your physical integrity remains a fixed variable. What is the post-operational objective? Adrienne inquires, probing her long-term cognitive state. Her response has been forged in the crucible of her history. I intend to function as a sanctuary for the displaced. I will establish a facility where the psychologically fractured can experience a tranquility that does not trigger a threat response. We shall establish that structural base as a singular unit, he pledges. This is no mere emotional platitude, but a bilateral blood oath between two traumatized entities seeking a clinical resolution. That evening, her internal auditory hallucinations are suppressed, and she enters a state of unconsciousness that possesses the genuine flavor of liberation. The ballroom is a pressurized chamber of luxury fabrics and simulated social cues. Male subjects in $5,000 bespoke garments execute their roles in this gilded theater with robotic accuracy. Gregory Vale remains the gravitational center of this fabrication, absorbing accolades harvested from the fields of systematic betrayal and the enforced silence of his victims. He exhibits a classic megalomaniac narcissism, convinced his transgressions are buried beneath layers of capital. He fails to register her presence. Serena manifests in the entryway in deep indigo, projecting the authority of the shadow kingdom Adrienne constructed. Her history of trauma is completely camouflaged by a sophisticated veneer of absolute executive dominance. Initiate the terminal sequence, Adrienne whispers. She confirms with a definitive monosyllabic nod. As they enter, the atmospheric oxygen levels appear to plummet. Every attendee tracks Adrienne, the apex predator in silk, before their focus immobilizes on the apparition of the daughter presumed deceased, now exhibiting a dominant verticality. The elitist social facade begins to suffer a catastrophic structural failure. Subject Gregory exhibits acute autonomic arousal. His pallor shifts to a necrotic gray as he perceives a vengeful specter. Adrienne's tactile grounding stabilizes Serena's posture. Maintain sensory focus, he murmurs. Observe the blossoming of his amygdala-driven terror as his ego construct disintegrates under the weight of imminent finality. They navigate the assembly with the kinetic inevitability of a storm front. Adrienne presents the specimen to the power brokers, while Serena maintains a diamond-hard, catatonic stare. She has evolved from a marginal character into the primary architect of his psychopathology, surfacing from the void where he attempted her erasure. The environmental atmosphere is saturated with the irony of the elite celebrating a fraudulent altruist. Gregory experiences a psychosomatic constriction of the larynx as his fabrications tighten. Serena monitors his cognitive collapse until Adrienne provides the tactile signal, a tightening of the hand to initiate the clinical termination. A total systemic failure of the aesthetic facade occurs as the ballroom darkens. Behind a convulsing Gregory, the screens project a digital post-mortem of his transgressions. The $2 million contract on his daughter's life and cataloged forgeries are displayed, inviting the collective condemnation of his social hierarchy. A psychological vacuum grips the chamber. Gregory's features distort into a grotesque mask of narcissistic injury while he seeks an ally, encountering only the glacial judgment of his peers. The predator who spent 20 years harvesting lives now stands exposed, his fiscal armor stripped by the harsh illumination of reality. Gregory Vale. The vocalization fractures the silence like a kinetic impact. Law enforcement personnel flood the hall, led by a detective exhibiting high-status dominance. You are being detained. for grand larceny and attempted filicide. The fragile sanctuary he constructed undergoes a lethal fragmentation. Restrained and psychologically shattered, his gaze emits pure malignant resentment. "You parasitic traitor," he snarls, his internal moral decay fully visible. Serena remains affectively neutral. "I am no traitor," she asserts with surgical precision. "I have simply resigned from the role of the sacrificial lamb in your orchestrated delusion." The social structure collapses into a chaotic riot of panicked guests and strobe lighting. Adrian serves as a human shield, providing physical security through the debris until they reach transport. They depart as the city skyline dissolves into a mnemonic ghost that she is finally sanctioned to incinerate. As the physical boundaries of the estate close, her sympathetic nervous system finally deactivates. The psychological shackles of her developmental years undergo a terminal fracture. "It is concluded," she whispers. Adrian offers a correction. "You seized your own autonomy, Serena. I merely ensured the cost wasn't your mortality." A rare display of tenderness manifests as he adjusts her hair in the dim cabin. "Identify the next objective." "Yes," he inquires. While the inquiry is familiar, the interpersonal chemistry has undergone a fundamental shift. Serena observes him, stating her intent to construct a life that is psychologically indestructible. The trajectory ahead is cluttered with the wreckage of his reputation and media scavengers. However, she has undergone a process of tempering, emerging as hardened steel. The traumatized child in the closet is functionally extinct. She is Serena Vale, and she has formally abdicated from his tragic narrative. This represents merely the introductory phase of the collapse. By dawn, the media contagion spreads. Her devices are flooded with digital noise and the voyeuristic gaze of the public. Within her private sanctuary, she observes the masses consuming her traumatic history as if it were a choreographed performance. The corporate titans suffer a systemic downfall. Gregory is physically incarcerated as his empire of deception undergoes total liquidation. The narrative shifts. Headlines document his moral depravity alongside images of the new, lethal coalition between Serena and Adrienne. She is exhausted, yet her gaze reflects total self-governance. Elena delivers a situational report. The media scavengers have established a perimeter around the residence. 15 camera crews are entrenched. Security personnel are maintaining the defensive line, despite an unauthorized attempt by a journalist to scale the barricades and capture the fallout an hour ago. During her morning ritual, Serena inquires about Adrian's location. Elena indicates he has been neutralizing legal hazards since 4 in the morning, acting as a structural barrier between her and the world. He chooses to absorb the external pressures so she can process her recovery in the shadows. However, Serena refuses further isolation. She consumes her tea with calculated patience, recognizing the moment for her counterstrike has arrived. In the mirror, she observes a new psychological specimen. Her physical contusions are fading, but the true metamorphosis is occurring at a cellular level, the emergence of internal steel. A predatory spark ignites in her eyes. She locates Adrian in his command center, issuing directives with the cold efficiency of a military strategist. Upon her arrival, he terminates the transmission, his attention narrowing like a hunter tracking a target. He resembles a razor blade shrouded in bespoke tailoring. He offers a clinical apology for his team's suboptimal damage control. When Serena critiques his lack of subtlety, he acknowledges his methodology is purely visceral. He assesses her psychological stability. She confirms her resilience against deeper trauma. He then slides a massive dossier across the mahogany like a death warrant. This document details the 72-hour countdown to her father's total erasure. It is a clinical ledger of fraud and deception that eliminates all defensive options for Gregory. His legal counsel are merely specters in a graveyard. Adrian hasn't just constructed a cage, he has welded the exit shut. The academic legal language serves as a sterile mask for Gregory's social liquidation. Adrian confirms the presence of media scavengers seeking a blood sacrifice. Choose, he whispers. Do we allow the collective to consume you, or do we exert total control over the narrative together? He proposes a raw, clinical interview with Sarah Chen, devoid of artifice. He emphasizes that her testimony will function as the final weight on her father's metaphorical casket. Serena terminates the discussion by closing the file, the silence echoing the gravity of the words she has yet to externalize. She analyzes the security of her silence against a world eager to categorize her as a victimized pawn. She is finished allowing external entities to script her biography. Execute the plan, she declares. She will provide the testimony, but she will occupy the center of the stage alone. Adrian provides a slow, validating nod. The estate is transformed into a fortified theater for the deposition. Suddenly, the silence is ruptured by a communication from Detective Morris, the agent of Gregory's incarceration. Adrian activates the speaker, and the atmospheric pressure in the room spikes with the anticipation of an impending psychological storm. Morris's tone reflects the exhaustion of a man submerged in urban decay. The intelligence is negative. Gregory's legal specialists are weaponizing his philanthropic image to secure his release by 2 o'clock. They are attempting a desperate maneuver to return the apex predator to his familiar shadows. Adrian's expression petrifies into a mask of unyielding stone. Morris reports that the defense is constructing a pathological narrative, alleging Adrian utilized Serena to eliminate a competitor. It is a transparent fabrication, yet Gregory still commands powerful ghosts in high-status positions who can manipulate the legal machinery. The investigator requires a terminal blow, a revelation so profound it strips away the last of Gregory's perceived humanity. Adrian cedes the floor to Serena. She recognizes the insurance policy is her ultimate leverage. It is not a financial instrument. It is the death warrant authored in her father's own hand. However, Morris requires a physiological pulse, not just documentation. A policy can be dismissed by legal scavengers. They require raw evidence of his malice. Serena enters a state of deep introspection, descending into the cold architecture of her memories, to locate the moment her father's predatory nature was fully exposed. She recalls the frigid tonality in his voice when he ceased viewing her as a biological entity. 6 weeks ago, fueled by Scotch, he mused that every life possesses a market valuation, typically realized at the grave. He dismissed her very existence with the detached indifference of an actuary balancing a ledger. Morris demands every visceral detail of the exchange. Stealing her resolve, Serena echoes the patriarch's nihilistic gospel, the idea that even human waste has value and some lives are more profitable deceased. To the detective, this was the terminal evidence. The subject had finally narrated his own downfall. The confession serves as the introductory act. Morris requires the digital remains of the conspiracy. As Adrian's specialists dissect the electronic corpse of Gregory's life, the clock advances toward the 2 o'clock hearing. Any technical error will allow the predator to return to the hunt by sunset. Observing his lethal operational efficiency, Serena feels drawn to his shadow. Adrian warns that this trajectory leads to the witness stand, where legal predators will attempt a psychological vivisection of her story. It will be a public execution, yet she exhibits no flinch response. She is prepared for the blood. She welcomes the gathering of media vultures outside the perimeter. Refusing to remain a phantom in his machinery, she watches Adrian's team unearth the digital rot. By midday, they have identified a pathology far more advanced than any of them had hypothesized during their initial assessment. The data represents a cartography of a soul's total decay. Bribes to officials and directives issued to a fixer named Jay regarding a nuisance. By 1:30, Morris's voice crackles with the adrenaline of a hunter who has finally driven his spear into the dart of the specimen. The momentum has shifted. The judiciary has entombed Gregory, denying all bail requests. To finalize his ruin, federal agents have broken his primary enforcer, a subject named Jimmy Rohr. Now Rohr is providing full disclosure to avoid being permanently discarded within his own institutional cage. Rohr delineates the mechanics: a 50% down payment for a mechanical malfunction, a clinical termination with 0 forensic traces. As Adrian processes the monetary value placed on her life, his grip on the device blanches his knuckles to the color of bone. The silence is physiologically oppressive. Had Adrian not intervened that evening, Serena would be a chalk outline and a statistical file number. She retreats to her sanctuary, her perception of reality undergoing a radical shift. The concept of a father liquidating his daughter's life like a failing asset is a cold that settles permanently in her marrow. The patient exhibited acute respiratory distress until the male subject functioned as a stabilizing anchor. He utilized a predatory stillness, offering silence as a psychological buffer. When she attempted to project a fabricated affect, he deconstructed the defense mechanism, facilitating a necessary emotional collapse. Her vocalization fractured while disclosing the core trauma. The paternal figure had attempted a total psychological dismantling. Adrian provided a clinical autopsy of Gregory's pathology, framing the subject as a mere variable. Consequently, her grief mutated into a lethal, focused hostility. The period for mourning phantoms concluded. She was not grieving a father, but the structural void where a guardian should have existed. Amidst the stasis, she recalibrated her internal rhythm, acknowledging her facilitator for perceiving the fundamental self beneath the psychological debris. He attempted to deflect the validation, but the patient demanded radical honesty. Despite the potential for avoidance, he chose emotional proximity to the trauma. He finally articulated his own history of vicarious suffering, the dissonance of witnessing a loved one's psychological disintegration. In the patient, he perceived a familial echo, a memory serving as an inescapable cognitive anchor. Serena questioned if she was merely a form of moral restitution, but he admitted the dynamic had evolved into a primal connection. After 3 days, Sarah Chen arrived. The setting was a literary mausoleum, heavy with the scent of decay. Adrian assumed a rigid, statuesque posture as the interrogation commenced. Serena began articulating the architectural failures of her development, prepared for the external clinical evaluation of her survival strategies and every syllable. The interviewer's queries bypassed superficial narratives, targeting the marrow of the trauma. The atmosphere became sterile as she identified the onset of lethal intent. Serena's affect was hollow. She had identified the predator, yet failed to predict her role as the primary target. The decision to terminate one's own genetic lineage represents a profound psychological aberration. The public persona of Gregory Vale was a curated delusion, a gilded veneer masking a systemic graveyard. The worshipped icon was merely the ethereal residue of a truly malignant entity. Beneath the altruistic mask resided a high-functioning sociopath who destroyed lives with detached precision. Serena demanded her subjective truth override the societal noise. Regarding Adrian, she resisted the narrative that she was a psychological puppet under his tactical controller influence. She rejected the role of a collateral asset in a corporate game. Adrian facilitated her recovery without transactional expectations, providing a laboratory to refine her offensive capabilities. She refused to be a footnote in his pathology. She was the primary architect of her autonomy. The subject identified as a survivor who secured a psychological stronghold within the chaos. When queried about the future, Serena noted the absence of a structured plan, yet her primary objective remained: the systematic destruction of the predatory networks currently ensnaring others. She sought tangible significance over obscurity. Post-interview, Adrian administered a chemical sedative, 2 measures of neat whiskey. As Serena reclined, the crushing atmospheric pressure of her history finally began to dissipate into the surrounding air, leaving her in a state of relief. He commended her composure, noting the psychological weight of transparency surpasses tactical gains. They navigated the unresolved tension and ambiguity lingering like particulate matter in the room. Currently, the lack of a formal definition was the only empirical reality they both possessed. He categorized them as 2 damaged archetypes navigating a void without a moral compass. It was not a romantic projection, but a stable foundation for her psyche. However, this tenuous psychological equilibrium was violently disrupted exactly 7 days following the interview. The judicial machinery initiated its process. As Gregory's infrastructure leaked classified data, his associates exhibited typical abandonment behaviors. His reputation became a social toxin, his assets frozen. Simultaneously, Serena began conditioning her physical form into the very instrument of her father's failure. A tenuous synergy forms between 2 analytical minds. Evenings are dedicated to the exchange of deep-seated truths in the shadows. A compelling interpersonal force emerged, a psychological tension they hesitated to categorize. Tonight, the environmental atmosphere finally reaches its ignition point. The subject is observed on the balcony, utilizing nicotine as a minor coping mechanism for high stress levels. Below, legal representatives engage in transactional negotiations, attempting to exchange proprietary secrets for the elder subject's release from the encroaching grasp of the state. They exchange evidence for leniency, a compromise Adrian finds ethically repugnant. He projects defiance into the night, promising total accountability. Should legal frameworks collapse, social infamy shall serve as the permanent corrective sentence for the target in question. His aggressive vocalization provides the subject with a paradoxical sense of stability. She queries if she is merely a collection of fragmented psychological shards. He counters with intensity. She is not undergoing disintegration. She is undergoing a necessary process of structural reinforcement. He classifies her hostility as a functional drive rather than a psychological deficit. He utilized similar affective states to survive his siblings' demise. That resentment serves as the industrial core for their eventual retribution and the foundation of their future weapon. Transmuting hostility into a systematic mission is his primary psychological doctrine. He evolved into the protective structure he once lacked, shielding vulnerable subjects from predatory entities. It remains a morally ambiguous path, yet it is his chosen and defined purpose. He acknowledges his lack of moral purity, but rejects passive observation. Serena is captivated by his intense affect, enveloped by the scent of tobacco and power. She verbalizes gratitude for his intervention in rewriting the terminal conclusion of her tragic narrative. He dismisses the validation, attributing her survival to self-directed agency. In the decelerated cadence of the room, tactile contact is established. They breach a psychological boundary that had previously functioned as an inhibitory barrier, crossing a line they can no longer ignore. The intimate encounter represents a territory devoid of chronic anxiety. His vocal resonance provides a promise of security. For the first time, the subject's cognitive foundation feels structurally sound, like solid stone beneath her feet, providing a rare moment of peace. Verbal communication is insufficient for this bond. This is not a conventional romantic attachment, but a strategic alliance of traumatized survivors. They stand amidst the ruins of their pasts, defined by the psychological resilience required to remain present in the aftermath. Within her private space, she dismantles the external persona. Where observers perceive a predator, she identifies a survivor. From a clinical perspective, monsters are frequently categorized as victims who reached their threshold for exploitation and grew tired of being preyed upon. She visualizes a scenario of restorative growth where sunlight replaces the darkness. Then the morning cycle commences. A sudden eruption of kinetic violence shatters the environmental stasis, mimicking the acoustic profile of a firearm discharge from the lower levels. A secondary antagonist emerges in the office, 60 years of age, exhibiting aggressive territorial behaviors and shark-like traits. He issues a predatory warning to Adrian, signaling that a more lethal chapter of the ongoing psychological war has officially begun. Gregory's associates maintain long-term memory of grievances. Adrian assumes a rigid, statuesque posture. When the antagonist verbalizes the subject's name, the environmental atmosphere becomes physiologically oppressive and cold, signaling a dangerous shift in the room's dynamic. The antagonist mocks the male subject's domestic arrangement, utilizing a derogatory label. Serena emerges from the periphery, refusing her status as a ghost. Her physical presence acts as a cognitive disruptor to the hostility, halting the aggressive behavior like a physical blow. The antagonist's gaze is characterized by predatory intent. Serena rejects the classification of property, asserting her identity as a survivor. Adrian introduces the individual with an effectively flat, final, verbal warning, signaling the end of any potential diplomatic resolution. Adrian severs the association with clinical detachment. The antagonist directs his attention to Serena, articulating the cost, a blood debt for her father's decline. She responds with a singular, concise, verbal act of defiance, refusing to yield to the looming threat. Serena posits that social disgrace is insufficient for the crimes committed. The antagonist dismisses this, perceiving her as a sacrificial asset. He warns of incoming predatory threats. Adrian finally loses emotional regulation, demanding the subject's immediate departure into the night. Utilizing a false sense of fraternity, the antagonist designates Serena as an active target. He recedes into the shadows, a temporal trigger for imminent violence. Serena remains in the aftermath, exhibiting visible somatic tremors as the reality of the threat settles in. Acute terror manifests. She is now a primary target. Adrian provides the stark clinical reality. Her father's former associates seek violent retribution now that the financial assets have been liquidated. The ghosts of the past are hungry for blood. These predatory actors require a scapegoat for their financial ruin. The conflict was already in a state of high tension before her arrival. Serena was not merely a guest. She served as the decisive catalyst for the fatal explosion of violence. Evaluating the environmental threats, she perceives herself as a strategic liability. Adrian's professional facade disintegrates. The situation is catastrophic. All previous avenues for retreat have been systematically eliminated and are currently in flames, leaving them trapped in the present. Perceived betrayal emerges within his organization while the antagonist prepares to strike. The reality is delivered with blunt psychological force, yet she prefers this harsh, jagged reality over the soft, manufactured delusions that once defined her existence. Adrian disregards external moral evaluations or societal judgment. To him, she is a high-value entity worth the conflict, not a disposable pawn. He commits to her proximity, regardless of whether the entire city collapses into flame and ruin around them. A deliberate tactile gesture solidifies the alliance. A new psychological resilience manifests within her. If the predators are approaching, the erasure of her identity will prove more complex than they anticipated. She is no longer a victim. An auditory stimulus disrupts the silence. Marcus, displaying a flat effect, announces the arrival of law enforcement. Inevitability has reached their location, and the intent of the officer is clearly not for the purpose of a peaceful conversation. Within the correctional facility, Gregory Vale failed to evade his mortality. A professional strike targeted his vital organs. Adrian identifies the event as a premeditated betrayal coordinated by internal actors, confirming that the Empire has begun to eat itself. A covert benefactor funded the neutralization of Vale. The message is clinical and clear. The opposition will persist until the entire genetic lineage of the Vale family is systematically eradicated, leaving no trace of the bloodline behind. Physical barriers are irrelevant against $1 million incentive. Now, the judicial system scrutinizes them both. They are being strategically framed as the masterminds behind the prison assassination, a move designed to neutralize them through legal means. The collective demands retribution. The prosecution seeks a high-profile trophy. The detective understands Adrian's psychology, but the public perception is catastrophic. Society demands a theatrical display of justice, regardless of the actual empirical truth behind the events. The defense employs a classic projection strategy, feigning victimhood while claiming a vendetta. Adrian presents his data logs, externalized memories, while Morris observes the escalating environmental threat. True apex predators bypass judicial constraints. Following the investigator's exit, the female subject undergoes a psychological collapse. The progenitor's lifelong pathologies have reached a state of terminal maturation. The psychic debt is called in at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Adrian attempts to regulate her respiratory distress, though the atmosphere has become chemically oppressive. He clings to the delusion that veracity provides immunity, even as the walls of her psyche begin to buckle. While the legal system engages in its performative rituals, Adrian pursues the financial scent. An auditory trigger isolates the female subject within the vast, sensory-deprived environment of the estate's hollow silence. The architectural scale of the residence begins to function as a crushing stimulus. Inside the library, her cognitive processes devolve into a cacophony of phobias. The sanctuary has inverted into a cage. Vincent's psychological toxicity persists until Elena intervenes. The subject unloads her trauma, the carceral violence, the interrogation stress. The cognitive load has exceeded her capacity for isolation. The burden is too massive. Elena identifies the subject as the primary target. She reinforces the concept of Adrian's residence as a psychological and physical bulwark. Despite the external variables, she is currently in the only secure environment. Elena displays overt contempt for Vincent, viewing him as a low-level scavenger. Her 8-year observation of Adrian confirms a specific behavioral pattern. Under extreme duress, he does not fracture. He sharpens into a lethal instrument. He lacks moral elevation, but his fixation is total. The female subject experiences anxiety of consequence, fearing her affection will trigger his destruction. Elena observes that in this ecosystem, love is a self-imposed pathology. They engage in rhythmic, grounding kitchen tasks, slicing, grinding, breathing. It is a brief period of sensory regulation. Then, Elena introduces a verbal stimulus designed to penetrate the subject's emotional defenses. Elena dissected the girl's ego, bypassing the legal and protective layers to reach the core trauma. The subject's vocalization was a desperate plea. She craved the permanent erasure of her father's psychological shadow. She demanded a reckoning to bleach her lineage. She sought a state of cognitive clarity, far from the dissociative existence of a fugitive. After years of spectral living, the sudden return to emotional awareness felt physically burdensome. It was a violent, physiological reintegration into a real world. Was this a genuine emotional bond or the sympathetic resonance of shared trauma? Elena posits that these high-stakes obsessions are worth the biological cost. Then Marcus interrupts the frame, a visual cue that Adrian is calling for an emergency session. They located the Alpha in his control center, flanked by 3 silent, imposing guards. The environment hummed with the neurological anticipation of violence. The subject refused the passive role of the observer in her own impending trauma. Tony, a man whose features were an atlas of traumatic exposure, issued the clinical assessment. A termination order for her progenitor was signed 48 hours prior. The subterranean machinery of the syndicate had already engaged toward a final conclusion. $500,000 for a surgical execution, $1 million for a staged catastrophe. The architect is Marco, a puppet of the Castellano organization. The subject observed the cold, fiscal valuation of her father's vital signs with a visceral tremor. Marco's objective is the total elimination of the witness before federal cooperation begins. The loss of $20 million has induced a state of collective homicidal mania. In this theater, a deceased witness is the only variable that prevents a conviction. The psychological shadow deepened as they realized Marco was charting her routines with predatory obsession. He had archived her nocturnal patterns and movements with clinical precision. He was a silent voyeur, stalking the rhythm of her existence. A state of total isolation was imposed. Adrian mandated her confinement within the reinforced perimeter. Any exit would necessitate a military escort to maintain her biological stability. The estate had evolved into a high-security containment unit for her protection. Adrian transitioned into a state of hyper-focused lethality, reinforcing the boundary while planning the encounter with Marco. Despite the subject's autonomic nervous system failure, Adrian remained an ocean of clinical calm. He discussed the upcoming attrition as a transaction. In this sociopathic circle, one either establishes a dialogue or a burial site. Adrian intended to neutralize the aggression before the first discharge occurred. It was a high-stakes, choreographed negotiation between a truce and a bloodbath. Adrian identified that a failure to engage would result in an unacceptable casualty rate. He entered the subject's intimate space, his voice a singular, predatory promise. Any aggression directed at her would trigger the Alpha's absolute, unyielding retaliation. He was navigating the threshold between a diplomatic resolution and a funeral procession. The subject finally perceived the visceral architecture of his world. The wealth and the shadows were merely tactical assets in a terminal endgame of survival. She attempted to exert agency, but his rejection was an absolute surgical boundary. He would enter the conflict zone alone to resolve the accounts. There was no capacity for negotiation. He dissolved into the midnight air without a backward glance. Her vocalized descent ceased. Adrian departed at 8 in the evening with his primary enforcers. The subject was left in a state of cognitive dissonance, while Elena provided superficial comforts that failed to mitigate the impending threat. Elena articulated a harsh reality regarding their socio-political environment. This is a predator's ecosystem. One either possesses the inner heat to survive the friction or is reduced to cellular waste. The subject sipped her tea, her heart heavy with dread. Elena posed the ultimate diagnostic query. Could she maintain an attachment to a man existing on the precipice of annihilation? She noted that Adrian's fixation on the subject had reached a state of terminal velocity. The trajectory remained binary: escape into anonymity or be crushed by the gravity of his position. She was caught between the tactile comfort of his presence and the psychopathic nature of his rivals. Every outcome appeared to be a violent inevitability. 120 minutes of sensory deprivation passed before a combustion engine announced his return. Adrian emerged physically intact but psychologically depleted by the evening's exertion. To suppress the traumatic echoes, he consumed a heavy dose of amber spirits. The blood pact is formalized. Marco cancels the termination order, while Adrian agrees to suppress decades of institutionalized corruption. This is the essence of a sociopathic treaty, a fragile peace maintained by mutual blackmail and non-aggression. A darker clinical observation emerged. Marco implied that a rapid execution would have been a humanitarian act. The legal dissection awaiting her father promised a slow, systemic destruction that made a bullet seem like a therapeutic release. Gregory Vale was condemned to decompose within 4 walls of industrial steel, his legacy reduced to a punchline. The subject remained in a state of catatonic apathy, anticipating only his slow biological decay. Her resolve had finally reached a diamond-like density. Malice is a slow-acting neurotoxin, a truth Adrian carried in his core. In the profound shadows, these 2 fractured personalities found a desperate, jagged sanctuary, attempting to stay afloat in a sea of hereditary trauma. Adrian discarded his external persona, demanding a final moment of psychological clarity. He questioned if her presence was a choice or a survival reflex to her own environmental collapse. He required the raw, unvarnished truth, stripped of all performance. He provided a rare, vulnerable insight into his psychological state, confessing a fixation that transcended normal parameters. By exposing his life to the risk, he dared her to reveal if her love was an organic reality or a scripted trauma response. Having observed her resilience during the collapse of their social structure, he now searched for his own continuity in her gaze. It was a massive cognitive shift for a man who had previously lived only for the immediate kill. The subject was plagued by the shadows of the syndicate, yet she opted for this volatility over a hollow, secure life. To her, an existence outside Adrian's violent orbit would be a narrative without a soul, a projection without light. Their connection had evolved into something more profound than a simple obligation. It had become a state of inescapable psychic gravity. Though the verbalization was difficult, her commitment to the man was now absolute and pathological. A prolonged, silent contact marked their transition into the unknown. They had systematically destroyed all paths to safety. They were now a singular, unified entity standing against an increasingly hostile environment. They stood prepared for the psychological attrition of the trial. As her father's criminal empire disintegrated, she achieved a state of paradoxical equilibrium. She was shielded by a man who was, in his very DNA, a lethal instrument. Biological survival was their only metric of success. As the cold October atmosphere signaled a seasonal shift, the subject entered the legal complex with the bearing of an aristocrat, her navy suit functioning as psychological armor. With Adrian orchestrating the movement and Marcus operating as a spectral observer, they bypassed a pack of predatory journalists. The subject prepared to enter the fire, driven by a singular, white-hot demand for a final reckoning. Outside, the air vibrated with the stimulus of strobe lights and invasive inquiries regarding her progenitor's demise. Inside the courtroom, the environment became clinically cold, saturated with a heavy silence that carried the scent of judgment. Linda, the lead prosecutor, provided a cold, strategic stabilization. She warned that the defense would attempt to dismantle the subject's psychological integrity, urging her to remain a monolith of fact and let the truth act as a crushing weight. The gallery was a dark assembly of the traumatized and the ruined. There sat Gregory Vale, no longer a titan of industry, but a withered shadow draped in the neon humiliation of an orange prison jumpsuit. Subject A's facial pallor shifted to a necrotic gray, his ocular responses oscillating between acute hostility and primal autonomic fear. The courtroom's atmospheric pressure mirrored a pre-storm electrical surge as the adjudicator assumed his position. The indictment cataloged a profound moral disintegration, systematic embezzlement, grand larceny, and calculated filicide of his own offspring. Legal counsel exhibiting classic predatory litigation tactics prepared to construct a labyrinth of obfuscation and shadow. This architect of avarice utilized a victimhood narrative, pathologizing Serena's trauma as a dissociative hallucination. While the defendant engaged in performative martyrdom, the subject stabilized her emotional regulation through subject B's proximity amidst the data-driven interrogation. The initial cognitive fatigue of technical testimony transitioned into a slow-simmering collective resentment as the human attrition was quantified. The liquidation of retirement accounts and the gutting of philanthropic entities exposed the pathological, predatory nucleus of the defendant's enterprise. A pervasive melancholia saturated the chamber during victim impact statements. The defendant maintained a posture of pathological grandiosity, projecting toxic directives toward his counsel. During the adjournment, Serena analyzed whether the subject perceived the total erosion of his perceived sovereignty. Subject B intervened during a period of sensory overload, encouraging autonomous breathing. As she processed the collateral damage of her father's trajectory, it became evident he hadn't merely misappropriated capital. He had psychologically and financially neutralized the futures of thousands. She articulated a sense of psychological burial among the other casualties. The evidentiary momentum shifted, requiring her testimonial contribution during this peak emotional volatility. Her companion served as a primary attachment figure, offering a withdrawal strategy should the cognitive load become debilitating. Rejecting avoidance behaviors, Serena confronted the source of her trauma. She occupied the witness stand and performed the ceremonial oath on a text of zero subjective significance, prepared to deconstruct 24 years of intergenerational toxicity. The primary subject finally accessed her vocal agency. Following the procedural introductions, the diagnostic lens refocused on her developmental years. Serena illustrated a chilling dynamic. Gregory functioned purely as a biological progenitor, his capacity for empathy having undergone total necrosis following the maternal loss when she was 14. He evolved into a practitioner of sophisticated psychological attrition. Serena adopted a high-vigilance survival state, recognizing that minor environmental deviations triggered his explosive affective dysregulation. At 16, a trivial domestic error culminated in a high-impact physical assault against the structural masonry. That trauma resulted in a severe traumatic brain injury, which he clinically dismissed to medical staff as an accidental fall. Over the defense's reactive objections, the prosecution mapped out the subject's physiological history, a systematic record of every osseous fracture he inflicted. Her testimony functioned as a detached psychological autopsy, her affect remaining chillingly flat as the jury witnessed the depravity. Then, the clinical revelation: Gregory had surreptitiously assigned a $2 million valuation to her termination via an insurance instrument. To the subject, that policy represented a formal execution order. Every antecedent physical assault was merely a behavioral rehearsal for the eventual monetization of her expiration. No amount of legal maneuvering can now sanitize the record of his fundamental sociopathy. She detailed his intoxicated diatribes, particularly one occurring 6 weeks prior to the assassination attempt. He had exhibited a fragmented, psychotic mirth, positing that human detritus carries a specific market value and that individuals are statistically more profitable as corpses. A profound sensory deprivation gripped the room, unsettling even the most desensitized observers. Serena concluded she was never a familial entity, merely a high-liquidity asset. As counsel concluded, the defense attorney, Porter, initiated his approach with a predatory, calculated smile. Porter attempted to reframe her psychological trauma as a scripted, theatrical production, utilizing a tone of manufactured empathy. He initiated a systematic destabilization of her cognitive recall, attempting to persuade the jury that her testimony was a fabricated reality. He attempted to pathologize her history, but Serena countered with the analytical precision of a surgeon. She clarified that post-maternal bereavement therapy was a protective mechanism, not a deficit. Her pharmacological intervention was a survival necessity within a high-trauma environment. The interrogation transitioned into blatant gaslighting, characterizing his volatility as the burden of managing a maladaptive child. When he cited her 17-year-old psychiatric admission, she revealed the diagnostic truth. It was a self-termination attempt to sever the bond with her abuser. Porter exhibited a sneering contempt, labeling her a resentful failure seeking a scapegoat. He insinuated she had simply aligned with a different predatory faction, but Serena maintained the catatonic, lethal stillness of a sub-zero climate. The lawyer characterized her narrative as an opportunistic fiction synchronized with his client's financial collapse. Serena retaliated, asserting that 9 years of systematic ego destruction and a literal fiscal bounty on her life was not a screenplay. It was her foundational reality. Porter dismissed the testimonial evidence, framing her medical history as a desperate bid for narcissistic supply. He utilized physical intimidation, his silhouette lengthening across the witness box in a terminal effort to fracture her psychological resilience. He depicted her as a subject lost within the labyrinth of a fragmented psyche. However, as Serena observed the defendant in his correctional attire, the power dynamic underwent a total inversion. She was no longer the designated victim. She held the ultimate analytical authority. She addressed the jury with absolute cognitive clarity. For a decade, her progenitor systematically dismantled her identity. Once her utility was exhausted, he placed a $2 million valuation on her demise to facilitate his own financial extraction. She maintained that no procedural theatrics could obscure the physiological evidence of his brutality. Porter's professional facade finally underwent a total structural failure. When he denied his adversarial status, she exposed his victim-blaming methodology. Her fear had transmuted into a stable, crystalline state. The dense silence indicated that Porter had lost his rapport with the jury. His defense strategy was reduced to metabolic waste. Counsel kept the redirective examination concise, allowing the psychological weight of Serena's testimony to settle within the juror's consciousness like lead. Regarding her motivation, Serena stated she was reclaiming a personal history that had been misappropriated. She stood as a representative for every psyche he had pulverized, demonstrating that truth is an irrepressible frequency. She exited the stand with a refined, triumphant composure. Her physiological motor control began to falter upon dissent, but Subject B's intervention provided immediate grounding. Amidst the catecholamine surge, she whispered that her objective was the complete eradication of his sociopathic legacy. It was a peak state of achievement. The prosecution concluded their case, leaving the defense's narrative sounding like an empty acoustic echo. Then, as the Tuesday illumination bisected the chamber, the architect of this systematic trauma occupied the stand to initiate his final pathological deception. Serena observed a masterclass in performative empathy. He cycled through the archetypes of the grieving widower and the insolvent debtor, even stimulating a lacrimal response for the child he had broken. It was a high-functioning display of pure interpersonal malice. However, Linda Hartwell prepared the forensic strike. She presented medical documentation from Serena's 16th year, evidence of a cranial fracture. She questioned if this domestic incident was merely the pilot phase of his ultimate betrayal. Gregory exhibited a verbal snarl, characterizing his own offspring as a histrionic personality who invited her own suffering. He posited self-inflicted harm. But Linda exposed the disparity. he maintained a hedonistic lifestyle while his daughter underwent physiological and psychological atrophy. An exemplary paternal figure, Linda noted with clinical sarcasm. She pivoted to the $2 million insurance instrument finalized before the escalation. The jury's perception of the man transitioned into the identification of a predator stalking his own genetic line. The evidentiary mass was insurmountable. This individual viewed his own progeny not as a sentient being, but as a fiscal exit strategy. His own digital archives revealed a father calculating her cardiac rhythm in terms of debt-to-equity ratios. His ego mask finally fractured as he ranted about high-stakes contracts valued at $2 million. Linda remained emotionally neutral. She pierced the dissonance with a singular inquiry. Had he contracted a professional to permanently delete his daughter from the census? The hired operative was prepared to testify for a $25,000 fee. Gregory shrieked about a coordinated conspiracy, but the logical noose tightened. Why would an individual facing life imprisonment perjure themselves for a stranger? The psychological trap had closed. The defense table descended into a terminal silence. Linda delivered the decisive blow. He had attempted to reconcile his ledgers with his daughter's biological fluid. The manipulation had concluded. The predatory luminescence in his ocular field finally extinguished. Linda initiated a forensic deconstruction of his psyche, reducing the megalomaniac narcissist to a cornered, autonomic organism. Her summation was not merely a legal argument, it functioned as a slow-motion ethical termination. The defense's maneuvers were a transparently hollow farce. For 6 grueling hours, Serena navigated a void of acute existential dread, anchored to reality only by the tactile pressure of Subject B's hand. He remained the singular stable variable in her environment. At 4:30, the chronological marker of judgment arrived. As the verdict was finalized, her cardiac rate accelerated against her thoracic wall like a captured frantic avian. The jurors' expressions were fixed in a lithic stare. Fraud. Substantiated. Grand larceny. Validated. Then the primary pathological event, attempted homicide. Guilty. The brittle structural integrity of his empire finally underwent total collapse. The chamber dissolved into a state of high-entropy chaos. Amidst the vocalizations and strobe-like flashes, Gregory's infantile dysregulation was neutralized by the gavel's terminal impact. For Serena, the protracted, cryogenic phase of her existence had finally reached its conclusion. The horizon of his liberty permanently receded. 40 years for his financial crimes, and life without parole for the attempted filicide. It was a cold, algorithmic form of justice. Serena's emotional containment finally experienced a total breach. Gregory Vale was now a subject destined for permanent containment in a concrete sarcophagus. He attempted a final ocular connection, but custodial staff extracted him like biological waste. Serena scanned her internal state and identified only a profound, restorative silence. Externally, the media scavengers were positioned. With stabilized respiration, Serena addressed the collective, exposing the hollow exoskeleton of the man who once dominated her reality. She described a progenitor who calculated human existence as a mere transactional currency. The subject's offenses transcended fiscal theft. They constituted a total psychological annihilation. Currently, her trauma has reached its terminal half-life. She exits into the sunrise, a rare case of successful psychic rebirth. Upon entering the vehicle, she experiences a somatic release of years of autonomic tension. While the companion queries her state, she reports total emotional depletion. The labor of moving mountains has left her psyche utterly exhausted. The male provides a stabilizing narrative of gradual resocialization. That night, the subject remains in the darkness, where courtroom echoes continue to reverberate through the hollow, pathological shadows of her parietal lobe. Legal success yields a sensory profile of ash and bitterness. She locates the male in the library's midnight void. The residence is saturated with a silence more permanent and haunting than any forensic proceeding. She interrogates his history of vengeance as a curative measure. He identifies it as a narrative closure rather than a restorative psychological act. Despite the paternal removal, the subject suffers from persistent depersonalization. The male counters her regression, reframing her identity as a survivor rather than a victim. He posits that neurological recovery is a fractured trajectory where inertia is common, yet forward motion remains the primary objective. The subject finally purges the forensic filth from her respiratory system. Her gaze shifts toward a distant horizon, contemplating the terrifying cognitive dissonance required to simulate a normal existence. She proposes self-imposed isolation to protect him from her internal ghosts, a classic avoidant defense. He rejects the deception, labeling her the solitary dawn in his sociopathic world. A profound psychological enmeshment. While the environment fractures, he provides a physical anchor. He pledges to construct a citadel, a literalized defense mechanism sealed by a single kiss, heavy with 1,000 ancestral blood oaths. No transactional debt persists. Only a primal, visceral hunger for proximity. He functions as the iron foundation of her reality. Her autonomic breathing is the only objective truth he recognizes. They achieve a temporary state of mindfulness. Reconstruction of their world begins at daybreak, but for now she breathes. The antagonist is a spectral memory. The nightmare has been surgically drained. Biological life demands sweat and hemoglobin. Near the shoreline, she discovers a hollowed steel chassis. To the uninitiated, it is industrial waste. To the subject, it is a mirrored reflection of her own internal anatomy. He perceives a graveyard where she envisions a sanctuary. Nevertheless, the male maintains constant physical contact. Should she hallucinate a home within the wreckage, he will manifest that delusion into reality. "It is a corpse," he observes. "Like I was," she replies. They acquire the decay on a prayer. 4 months later, the ruin demonstrates biological respiration, a miracle of structural restoration. The seasonal transition buries the rot. Stone gates and botanical growth emerge like a phoenix from the debris. The lingering chill of the previous haunting is finally interred. They designate the facility Haven House. The subject directs the restoration with a voice like tempered iron, forcing the architectural light to align with a new, artificial sun. The blueprints serve as somatic medicine. Recovery zones below, 12 cloisters above. She secured the capital independently, effectively leveraging her trauma to achieve the rank of a clinical peacebringer. Critics attempted a character assassination, but her calloused hands silenced the forum. The males, Adrian and Marcus, undertake the physical burden of manifesting this shared dream. 1,000 documents for a mountain of grace. As the social elite circle like predators, the male monitors her pulse, observing a steady, terrifying level of composure. 8 lives are tethered to her cardiac rhythm. The male provides an atmospheric anchor, swearing she may undergo stress fractures but will never snap. Survival has become her sovereign kingdom. The victim archetype is deceased. The architect remains. As the forensic witness enters the driveway, she prepares to reveal her masterpiece, a sophisticated form of constructive vengeance. The lens captures the objective truth, while the two move in a synchronized, silent rhythm of obsessive devotion and manual labor. The subject steps into the radiance of her own autonomy, while the male remains a shadow guardian, shielding her posterior for all of eternity. The male liquidates his dark inheritance to establish a harbor where shattered psyches can finally reintegrate their fragmented components. A sovereign of the shadows reaches for the light, finally deducing that a woman's internal peace is the only empire worthy of strategic defense. This structure stands as a monument to the clinical fact that a single drop of mercy can neutralize an entire ocean of predatory cruelty. Two fractured entities now resonate at the same frequency. The subject finally synthesizes the vocabulary required to describe the internal fire she harbors for him. 100 crates of unresolved conflict remain, but their intertwined digits form a knot that no environmental storm can ever deconstruct. The perimeter opens. She stands at the eye of the storm, stabilized by the man who navigated hell just to maintain physical proximity. She possesses no academic degrees, only a doctorate in extreme agony, converting her complex trauma into a clinical sermon from the global audience. The formerly invisible girl has evolved into a woman with absolute perception, gathering the world's discarded souls under her protective, hyper-vigilant wing. Haven House is a vocalization that shatters the silence, a clandestine portal for those buried alive by the world's profound indifference. Initial survival was merely the first phase. Now, as she reaches the apex, the world observes a new psyche being birthed from the remaining ashes. 8 lives are held within her palms. She bears this crushing responsibility with a petrified expression, concealing the incandescent fire burning within her core. When the environment dictates negation, this facility offers affirmation. It serves as the final defensive trench against the total erasure of the human spirit. In a metropolis of ghosts, she has paved a thoroughfare of stone, forcing society to confront the faces they once systematically ignored. Under a blood-orange sky, she monitors the meteorological shifts. A storm is projected for next month, and she is cognitively prepared for the impact. The male functions as her gravity. Regardless of the wind's velocity, he provides the mass necessary to prevent her from undergoing a psychological fragmentation. Intimacy is a combat zone when both participants are covered in scar tissue, a tragic choreography of 2 hearts that forgot the mechanics of beating. A new subject, Jackie, collapses at the threshold, pursued by a predator who facilitates death. The clinical stakes have reached a terminal level. Security is not a commodity here. It is a biological requirement, a sacred right for those attempting to recover their own lost identities. Jackie exists as a phantom within her own skin, her mind a landscape of distorted lies planted by a monster to rot her soul. She delivers a cold diagnostic truth. The deceptions are venomous, and the only cure is a pain so intense it will bring you to your knees. She acts as the foreman of hope, laying foundations of courage and measuring the psychic mortar with the steady beat of her own survival. Maria, Tanya, and Lisa arrive, living maps of human suffering with traumatic narratives etched deeply into the hollows of their eyes. Subject exhibits spontaneous euphoria. The environment reverberates with a vitalized vocalization, signifying a deviation from chronic defensive silence. Following 21 days of combat, the subject shows psychological depletion. Her partner detects an atmospheric shift preceding lacrimal discharge. Recidivism in an auxiliary victim triggers the subject's internal judicial apparatus, where she assumes the roles of arbiter and punitive force. The facilitator functions as a threshold, not a terminus. Subjects must navigate solo. The savior complex remains a lethal aesthetic delusion. Survival inquiry, 11. Remnants persist in the wreckage. He advises redirection of libido toward living entities. Post-solstice, the ego fortress stabilizes. She systematically deconstructs urban predators, repurposing their influence into developmental infrastructure. Maternal identities are reclaimed. She has transitioned into a monolith. The male's erratic impulses have stabilized into a calibrated state. He dismantles his antisocial history while she monitors this metamorphosis with guarded anticipation. High humidity correlates with peak tension. He proposes an egalitarian partnership, testing her readiness for total, long-term psychological commitment. Tachycardia is evident as the male offers a symbolic token. He demands a transition from ward status to absolute raw equality. Domesticity triggers repressed trauma. However, the male's proximity during trauma enabled a successful cognitive reintegration of her previously fractured psyche. Vocalized consent initiates immediate tension reduction. A formal union is witnessed by survivors, serving as biological validation of their shared endurance. Observer Chen records a fragmented sociological unit, displaced persons, reformed combatants, and legal experts, a functional ecosystem born of collective trauma. The ritual is a visceral manifesto. The male displays a complex captor-savior fixation, seeking existential stability within her newly established reality. Contract finalization triggers a collective release. Marital status provides significant psychological weight. The subject now exerts total agency over her trajectory. Social integration occurs via rhythmic movement. She catalogs positive stimuli before retreating to isolated, celestial observation to process the joy. Under high contrast light, a peer initiates a progress assessment. The subject admits to vertigo. The peer validates this as the standard response. The facility mirrors the subject's resilience. Paternal betrayal served as the baseline for her hardening and subsequent localized defensive illumination. Out of catastrophe, she has synthesized a holy purpose. The male interrupts her reflection, but she asserts her current autonomous state. Utilizing the male for grounding, she constructs a fortified recovery zone, repurposing failing social systems into protective doors for the displaced. Public vulnerability serves as a therapeutic tool. Her private tragedy became a collective mirror, mitigating the isolated, lonely cold of communal pain. External validation drives her autonomic functions. The male purges his criminal infrastructure, seeking moral realignment despite the echoes of residual guilt. 365 days later, Gregory Vale expires. The megalomaniac narcissist failed in isolation. Subject experiences a respiratory pause, not triumph. Consanguinity acts as a toxic tether. The subject neutralized her primary abuser, passing a critical threshold. The monster has reverted to dust. Assessment reveals a neutral cognitive sea. News of the paternal death yields no relief, only a vacuum between the two subjects. No eulogies exist for megalomaniac narcissists. He expired in his self-built prison. They observe a silent vigil for the idealized paternal figure. Catharsis occurs for the child self, not the deceased. Stolen years are mourned. Post-release, thoracic pressure reduces, though scarring remains permanent. Subject prioritizes altruism as a coping mechanism. Every rehabilitated female is a victory over her abuser. The living require her focus. Forward progression is mandated. The facility becomes a lighthouse. Her narrative shifts from victimized testimony to a strategic, general survival blueprint. Output has reached global scale. The dyad established equilibrium, not dominance. A former patient has successfully cycled into a medical healer. Domestic stabilization is noted, yet relapse remains a constant threat. Some souls inevitably return to high-risk environments or fade away. 5 years of longitudinal data confirms her throne of light as the definitive psychological victory over her history of trauma. The subject's lived experience functions as a non-negotiable psychological directive, bypassing the need for traditional communication or microphones. A novel subject with profound ocular trauma seeks extraction from a high-risk environment, proving the perpetual demand for the protagonist's intervention. Guaranteed safety is provided. The male observes as the subject exercises total sovereignty over her specialized therapeutic psychological ecosystem. Historical shadows have retracted. The subject remains an unbreakable archetype, solidified by her successful navigation of extreme adversity. The primary project reaches completion. Both subjects exhibit physical exhaustion, but remain biologically and mentally operational in the aftermath. Subject monitors the flicker, fearing the loss of identity without the binding, blood-soaked debt of their shared, traumatic history. The male systematically incinerates his documented past, choosing to inhabit the tragic, beautiful dissonance of the current psychological moment. After exchanging verbal oaths, the pair integrates into a singular, dense, communal shadow, a total state of shared existence. Subject has completely subverted all external expectations, standing as the sole, independent architect of her own psychological fate. The facility mined the previous dynasty, refining ancestral screams and trauma into a stable, cold, gold psychological asset. Atmospheric tension dissipates as silence falls. The subject finally assimilates the total, unyielding weight of her own individual agency.